I think you probably get asked this often, but like I've never had an explanation that makes sense to me. But in Surah Nisa, like verse 34, when it says that like men can strike their wives, I was just wondering like an explanation that you have or an interpretation of that verse. Yeah, and why God had written that.
Okay. When it comes to, for example, that particular verse, can you read it out, the whole verse?
In English? Yeah. So men are in charge of women by right.
Can I have some of your water if you don't mind?
Over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are the obedient guardians of husband's absence. Allah will have them removed. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand.
Okay. Now, what would a feminist say to that?
Feminists, like that men shouldn't beat their wives?
Yeah. Under any circumstances, they would say. Okay. And what does, if you look into the actual explanation of this verse, and you look into the explanation of what scholars say, they would say there are conditions in which a man is allowed to hit his wife, if this thing is followed. In 1400 years of Islamic history, this thing has been discussed. No one can deny this is in the Quran. Okay? Now, the most direct explanation that someone would give of this is, if a woman is involved in behavior that is XYZ, then so-and-so Islamic scholar has said that he's allowed to hit her with what's like a miswak or something, right? Any feminist would say this is misogynistic, this is wrong, this is not allowed. When you carry on reading Surah Nisa and you read the other verses and you read the other verses in the Quran about women, it will say a woman gets half the inheritance a man gets. This coupled with a woman getting half the inheritance that a man gets, again, what would they say? They would say Islam is a misogynistic religion, it's a patriarchal religion. When you combine that with the idea that in Islam a woman has to wear a hijab but a man doesn't, what would their answer to that be? That would be, again, this is oppressive. If we carry on along this, we can come across maybe 7-8 things like this. I want to answer all of them in one go rather than one particular one. Islam says certain things which go against what men want and what women want. In both cases, the question that we have to ask is, why is Islam true? Because in Islam, one of the things which men love to do, for example, is business. You're not allowed to take interest. The most precious thing to wear is gold. Men are not allowed to wear it. When you're married, the man has to spend his wealth on the woman, but the woman can take her wealth and not spend it on the man. When it comes to silk, which is the best cloth, a man can't wear it, but a woman can. When there's a war going on, like there is in Ukraine, when there is a war and the Khalifa says you have to go to war, all the men have to fight, and if they die, they die, but the women don't have to fight.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off,
yeah.
But like, I have no issue with believing that Islam is true. And so my specific question is just that interpretation of the verse. Like, are men actually allowed to beat their wives? Like, Islam, is that okay?
Yeah. According to that verse, according to the interpretation for the last 1400 years, even the most liberal scholar will say that is something undeniable in the Quran. They will say even with a miswak, but no one will say that doesn't exist. No one will. And any Muslim that tries to sugarcoat it and say this verse doesn't mean that, they're going to do mental gymnastics and they're never going to come to a conclusion. The reason why I couple this with a whole bunch of other things is they're all related to fundamentally the question, is Islam true? Because what's worse, having to die and possibly be tortured by your enemies, or a man hitting his wife with a miswak? What's actually physically worse? Okay, no, sorry, let me just answer this. What's actually worse?
I mean, I just think those are very different circumstances that you can't,
No, okay, what situation would you rather be in? I'm just talking about in terms of unfairness, because the root cause of these questions is there's something unfair in the text. That's the root cause, right? But the same unfairness can be applied to the man who says, I have to go to beyond the enemy lines and fight and possibly be captured and tortured, which is far worse than being hit by a miswak. So in Islam,
But you said that's the most liberal interpretation. So what's the more strict one?
What's the topic about?
okay, okay. What I mean by
I understand your point, but
what I mean by liberal is not woke liberalism, because woke liberals will say that that's metaphorical, it doesn't exist. What I mean is, no one can deny that that's in the Quran. No one can deny that's in the Quran. No one can deny for 1400 years Islamic scholars have said this rule exists. No one can deny that. That's what I actually meant. And the reason why I coupled this with a whole bunch of other things is to show there are things in Islam which cannot be rationalized unless you look into why Islam is true. Because you have a problem with this. Do you also have a problem with a woman getting half the inheritance that a man gets?
Well, I think that's different because like men are required to provide for their family. So that makes sense to me.
But that doesn't make sense to a whole bunch of other women.
Yeah, well, I'm like that because probably because they don't understand the larger context. But I don't know, like to me.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Like that actually seems fair to me.
Okay.
Like, if men are required to provide for their family.
Okay. So let me ask you another way. If the Quran said that a woman, if her husband doesn't do X, Y, Z, and say the husband's involved in extramarital affairs, he does this or that, the woman's allowed to hit the husband, and the woman gets double the inheritance that a man gets. Would you accept that that is right? If it says that in the Quran, if it's the other way around.
I mean, so I have no issue with accepting that that's right. That's what I'm like. I have no issue with accepting that's right. I'm just wondering like what that actually means.
Right, can I
you know?
Okay, no, sorry, let me just complete this point. The point I'm trying to get to, sister, is that the ultimate reason why any Muslim should accept those verses or any other verses is because they believe it's from God, not because they can rationalize it. Because there are many things in Islam which are rational but cannot be rationalized. Okay? So for example, in Islam, alcohol is not permitted. Interest is not permitted. We believe behind every ruling in Islam, there's a rationale, there is a wisdom. Now, you've come to terms with the idea that women get half the inheritance of men because you've discovered the wisdom of it or you believe in the wisdom of it.
Yeah.
In Islam, Allah tells us behind everything that He legislates, there is a wisdom. Sometimes we have access to the wisdom, sometimes we don't have access to the wisdom. The point is, we have to submit if we believe Islam to be true. Certain things cannot be rationalized. Sorry, let me just finish this conversation first. The point I'm trying to get to is, certain things in Islam cannot be rationalized. You have to go back into why Islam is true.
Yeah, I get all of that. I'm just wondering specifically about that verse, like how, like you said, the most liberal interpretation is like, okay, like men can beat their wives in this walk, but like, how extreme does it go? Like, how much can they beat their wives and have it be, oh, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, listen.
Yeah.
So, what do you mean by the even the most liberal interpretation is that you can't deny it, and Saboor is very unapologetic about it.
Yes.
We're not trying to sugarcoat it and
Yeah.
say, oh look, it doesn't really exist or this or that. But you know, there's some context here. I understand what you're saying. That you're a Muslim, you believe in Islam, you understand why, and Saboor pointed out there are wisdoms behind certain things, and there's context that we don't fully always understand. Let me just add one thing to this. The context around it, even these verses being revealed, the Arabs before that used to beat their wives mercilessly, without mercy. Initially, it was forbidden, totally. And what happened is that because it went totally 180, then a lot of the people complained that...
How did it go totally 180?
By saying, first they used to, understand women's rights didn't exist before. Before Islam came along, right? Even in inheritance. You know when Muslim women were allowed to inherit half, a lot of people mocked Muslims. A lot of people mocked Muslims, you're giving women inheritance rights, things like that, right? With the beating verse, one of these very specific and addressed us very specifically. Initially, Arabs would beat their wives, very aggressive, merciful. And Islam came and said, no. But what happened is in a society that's so used to it, where the men were so dominant in that way, that a lot of people complain, hang on a minute, the women are born the other extreme now, they're taking full advantage and they're not able to manage and govern and so on. So when these verses came in, it came as a way to moderate. And when the meaning of the Isra means that it's something so small and meaningless, it reduced it down, but there's always a threat there, or some sort of threat. Like slavery. Islam doesn't say it's good, right? But it didn't outlaw it straight away. What happened? It discouraged it. And over time, what happened? It went, right? So there are certain wisdoms in the way that Islam came about. It's very practical. Even with alcohol, it was phased over time. This is just to finish this point, that this is the context where these verses came about. You have to remember, look in history, why these verses were revealed, in what context were they revealed. Even now, in a lot of societies, we spend a lot of time just now debating a guy who is promoting matriarchy and how women are on top and men should be subservient to them. But all of these, if you think about it, in most cultures we come from, you as women would not respect a man unless he's a man. So there's a lot of different contexts to speak about. And these verses were revealed in that particular context.
And I wanted to add something. The one who the Quran was revealed to understood it better than anyone, which is the Prophet. How many times did he beat his wives? Never. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, the best of you are the best to their wives. Why was the criteria to be the best human being, the best to your wife? Because you can act really nice in front of society, you can act really nice in front of your friends and family, but your real character is only known by your spouse. So Islam doesn't say wife beating's good and do it. This particular verse is for extreme circumstances. The Prophet, peace be upon him, never did it. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he had a woman come to him and the woman wanted to inquire about marriage proposals that she had, the Prophet discouraged her from marrying this guy because he was stingy, this guy because he's a wife beater. So Islam doesn't encourage wife beating. Islam doesn't encourage violence against women. This particular verse has to be understood in that context. And the way I see it is, this particular verse, for most women, I think for most men, even liberal men, not men in the past, but liberal men today, it cannot be rationalized. It simply has to be accepted if they go back to where it came from and they look at the context of it. Because there's many things in Islam, sisters, not just this. There's many things in Islam which can make someone leave Islam unless they go back to why Islam is true. So I'll tell you the story of one of my friends. One of my friends converted to Islam and he came from an egalitarian background, a liberal background. He found out that in Islam a woman cannot seek divorce. She can only get khula. She can't say talaq, talaq, talaq and get rid of her husband like the man can. There's an asymmetry there. And what happened was, this made him doubt Islam because he's a convert and he was brought up in a liberal feministic sort of way. After marriage he discovered, actually, I see a wisdom behind this. Whatever wisdom he discovered, he discovered. So sometimes these things are tests from Allah. They actually test from Allah to see whether we believe. And this is why the question always goes back to, why is Islam true? What did I do with the guy who's here before you? I'm not interested in all the questions that he has. I'm interested in showing him why God exists and why Quran is true. Because once we can know that Islam is true, it answers all these questions. Which is why I brought up this question of all the other things. Because there are a lot of things in Islam which are gender biased, which are not equal. Islam is not an egalitarian religion. I think a lot of Muslims brought up in the West, because we're brought up with liberalism and we're brought up with Islam, it's very hard for us to understand how do we reconcile the two. And my answer is, we don't have to reconcile the two because liberalism's wrong. It's actually pretty simple. It's actually harder to try and marry Islam to liberalism and reinterpret these verses in a woke way, because I could have said to you, that's metaphorical, and left it there. But that's not telling you the truth. You see? Make sense?
Try reading tafsir. Any verse you don't quite understand, find a tafsir you like, and then now nowadays so easy. You can go online and look at the tafsir, explanation of those verses.
Well, I mean, like, that's what you were saying, though, is that sometimes you'll just never understand the wisdom behind it. Which is, like, I guess I have a lot of questions about the wisdom behind some commandments. And, like, I don't, like, this... Yeah.
But that's where the seal will come in. That what you often find is that some wisdoms are explained. Not everything.
Yeah.
Some are explained. There are some ahadith that Saboor here gave you some ahadith of context behind it. Right? You'll get some of these explanations, tafsir, the commentary. You see?
For example, when we look at interest, interest may not mean a lot to you perhaps. It does to a lot of Muslim men who are into business, who are into, like, it's a massive constraint economically, especially if you live in the West. You can't get a house on mortgage, you can't get a finance on mortgage, you can't start off a business on mortgage. What is the wisdom behind that? We'll find out on the Day of Judgment. What is the wisdom behind the fact that in Islam, a man is given authority over a woman? Now, nobody can say that Surah Nisa doesn't say that. It does say that. It's the beginning of the verse, that men are the maintainers and protectors of women. It doesn't say they're equal partners. Now, that doesn't mean that one oppresses the other, but it does mean that one has authority over the other. And in Islam, for example, the Khalifa, the head of state, here in the UK, the Prime Minister can be a man, a woman, nowadays anyone in between. But in Islam, the Khalifa has to be a man. All the prophets were men. Now someone can turn around and say, this is wrong, this is patriarchal, this is not in line with 21st century wokeism. And we can say, yeah, that's fine. But what's the evidence that Islam is true? Here's the evidence, therefore we follow it. Look, Islam's not a religion of fashion. Islam's a religion of tradition. It's a religion which dates back hundreds of years, and it's a religion there with a divine origin. So it's not going to fit woke liberal ideologies. If you were brought up in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, this question would not even come to you. The reason why it's come to me and you and us is because we're brought up here in the West. So we have to understand, a lot of the time they're battling opposite ideologies, and we don't need to. We just need to drop the other ideologies and wholeheartedly understand that Islam is the paradigm. It's not a paradigm that needs to match up to others.
And I accept that. Yeah. Also, this is just another question. I guess it's not, I don't know if you would want to answer this or if you have time, but you brought up slavery and how, like, Islam kind of phased it out. But, like, I'm just wondering if there is any room, if someone wanted to bring back slavery right now, is Islam okay? Like, is that okay? Islamic?
So, I think it was Bin Baz who was asked this question. Was it Bin Baz or Uthaymeen? One of the scholars was asked about, there was a conflict, and he was being asked about this, and he said, no, that's finished. And someone, I'd need someone who has more knowledge on this to verify this, but I remember there was an opinion about a recent conflict in which slaves could have been taken, and the scholar said no. Now let me just explain something very important. There is zero slavery in Islam, okay? Slavery is zero rights. What happened in America when they were the transatlantic slave trade and in Europe, they took these people, they killed them, they butchered them, they raped them, they slaved them, they mutilated them, they gave them no rights. A slave by definition has no rights. Islam doesn't have slavery. Islam has something which is different, which is best to describe as bondage servants. Bondage servants. So I'll explain something. In the Quran it says, if a slave wants their freedom and they want to work towards their freedom, give it to them. That's in the Quran. And in the Quran, and the Prophet told us, treat people justly. The Prophet told us that the slaves should be eating the food that we're eating and they're wearing the clothes that we're wearing. That's not slavery. And also, there was a man that hit a slave. He hit a slave. He felt bad. He went to the Prophet. And the repercussion for hitting the slave was freed. This is not slavery. Islam has something different to it. And Islam encourages freeing of slaves and the right treatment of these people. So whenever we look at slaves, we think of what happened in the transatlantic slave trade. You cannot compare that to what happened. You know the Prophet's uncle Abbas, right? The Prophet's uncle Abbas. At one point he was a slave and he was freed. So we have to understand, slavery in Islam is a term which is used quite loosely. There's slavery in Islam. But I challenge anyone to show there's ever been one slave in Islam. Because a slave by definition has no rights. In the Quran and the Prophet say that slaves have rights. In fact, there's something really interesting. The Prophet forbade Muslims from saying my slave man or my slave girl, because the Prophet said you're all slaves of God. So there's actually authentic narration of the Prophet where he said, do not say my slave girl or my slave boy, right? What's the name of that guy in America who wrote a book on Islam and slavery? That
Islam and slavery.
the revert guy, Jonathan something.
Brown.
Jonathan Brown. What's his book called? Basically, Google this book called Jonathan Brown. This book is written about slavery. I haven't read it. I heard it's very good. Just letting you know. But these nuances are really important because no one had this 1400 years ago.
Just another question about that. What is the wisdom, or like what are the parameters around men having intercourse with their female slaves in Islam?
I believe that's covered in the book.
Again, a lot of these things were you have to put in a lot of your questions. It really helped trying to understand the context in which Islam came, how the pre-Islamic Arabia was, and the world was really. It put a lot of context. Even with that, Islam put rules down. So hang on a minute, you have to marry, there are rights to get her pregnant, etc., etc. There are certain things in there. Well, I suppose your wider question would be, why not just outright forbid everything, right? To make everything haram.
Even I don't think that men had to marry. They could just freely have intercourse.
No, there were rights that were given. Before that, there were no rights. You could do what you want. They would treat them like absolute property, like cattle. But there were rights given. No, you can't do that. But then there are certain things that are, again, in that context, in that society, in that time, it was very different. But what Islam did was, it didn't just, the whole of slavery, they didn't just abolish it straight away. So, no, it's all haram. That's it. Because they said society would collapse. It would have collapsed on itself. Again, Islam is...
collapsed if they weren't
Okay, so
sex with their female slaves.
let me explain to you how. Okay, let me explain to you how ancient warfare worked. Ancient warfare was all about reproduction is battlefield success. So what would happen is two tribes would fight each other. The women from these tribes, all their husbands would be dead. So you wouldn't just leave them; they would be taken by the other tribes and assimilated into that tribe. This was ancient times. Persia, Rome, China, India, everyone was doing the same thing. So what Islam said, it came and regulated that. It didn't ban it, it regulated it. Now someone could turn around today and say, I think the best thing would have been that Muslims just refused to engage in slavery at all and let the other empires engage in them, and they had greater reproductive success. From a purely sociological perspective, Islam would be at a massive disadvantage on the battlefield. So these things, look, sometimes it's very hard to understand objectively. But in warfare, a lot of the early times, there was no states. There was no borders. Everything in the beginning was the age of empires. It was to do with warfare. And reproduction was one of the fastest ways to replenish your troops, which is why people that could reproduce faster, they actually won greater land, they won greater territory, they had greater empires. It was a different universe. That's why a lot of those things today, when we try and understand them, we cannot understand them because the context has disappeared.
Well, so then that's my question. Like, if someone wanted to bring it back, like technically, like what in Islam is there that would like prohibit that? You know?
Okay, so in Islam, the Prophet taught us the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So, for example, I'm not a scholar. If I say something, I have to find it in the Quran, in the sayings of the Prophet, or the consensus of the first three generations of Muslims. That's it. That is Islam. So what we find is that if there's a contemporary problem today, say the war in Bosnia, during this conflict, female slaves could have been taken. But there was an Islamic scholar who's asked, and I think his name was Bin Baz or Uthaymeen, I don't remember which one of those scholars it was. He was asked, are we allowed to take female slaves? And the scholar said no, because that's finished. That was in the past. So to answer your question, can we bring slavery back? Well, according to scholars who are inheritors of the prophets, the answer is no.
It has like councils, specific councils and rules what the Islam, because it's a living religion, each time society adapts to it. So the scholars who will have inherited, that's why they inherit as prophets, because they will be turned for guidance and who will have the understanding of the full contents.
And there'll never be a consensus of Muslim scholars upon falsehood. You can always have one guy randomly saying X, Y, Z, but a consensus of the scholars will never be upon falsehood. Yeah.
Thank you. What were your guys' names?
Saboor.
Saboor Hassan.
Thank you.
Are you guys from the States?
Yeah, we are.
I just want to, which city are you from?
I'm from Minneapolis.
I find, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way at all, I've spent a lot of time at Speaker's Corner and I speak to people regularly. British Muslims don't really have these questions as much as American Muslims do. And I just wanted to ask you a question about this. Generally, when I find American Muslims, they are a lot more liberal than the Muslims here. Do you have the same experience?
I mean, I've only been in London for like 2 days and I haven't interacted with a lot of Muslims here, but like, yes, I actually can't answer your question.
No, just asking about America.
Oh, but compared to Muslims in London, I don't know. I don't interact with that many Muslims.
Okay.
In London, but I don't know.
I think they in the United States, you guys are in the Muslim community, especially in the American society, they're very cleverly linked minorities all onto the Democratic side, the left, leaning the liberal side, because they said, oh, these Republicans and the right, and they all like, oh, it's not us, and therefore I think maybe because of that, it's not a cultural influence.
I also think it's because when you look, for example, here in London, we have Chinatown with Chinese people. We have Golders Green with Jewish people. We have East London with lots of Muslims. I think in America, the Muslims are scattered all over the place. And that weakens the Muslim identity, it weakens the Muslim confidence, it weakens the ability of Muslims to articulate themselves. Because this pattern, I've seen it for so many years that I don't believe it's something that has no basis. So I was trying to figure out what is the actual cause. My understanding is because the Muslims in America because America's so big, they don't seem to have a strong community in one area. They all seem to be thinned out in different places.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I feel like geographically, like Europe is just closer to
The homelands of Islam, yeah.
So
Like Morocco is down the corner,
Around the corner, right?
Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Bosnia's in Europe. That could possibly be the case. Yeah.
I'd recommend, you guys are from the United States. There's 3 scholars in the United States I particularly recommend, especially for you, listening to your questions, that I find the explanations very good. One is Dr. Yasser Qadi. Right? Have a look at his explanations. There are a lot of videos online as well. Anything you type in.
Hello, my friend.
In terms of
How You're one of the very few Christians that wears a cross.
Good explanation. Dr. Yasser Qadi.
Are you strong in your faith? Huh? I'm Muslim. I respect, having cordial religious dialogues and these things because we live in the same world,
That's why
What are you, Roman Catholic or
so always look at these
English? Okay.
I don't want them DNA.
in the United States.
Huh?
I don't want them DNA.
Blessed with a lot of
Says
very,
so
very
I'll take
good,
that as well.
articulate, intelligent scholars.
Were you always religious?
So lean on them.
I literally just started this year. I started getting into the dialect of the Bible. I was listening to people talking about the Quran last year.
Listening to who?
Just on YouTube.
Okay.
About the Quran. Just trying to learn anything. So
Good.
that's what I mean. That's why I like it. So I'm struggling with a couple of these young boys just shouting and barking like absolute fucking weirdos. That's not dialect.
It's not, and there's a lot of people here like that. There's a bit of a shouting match. What made you turn towards religion if you weren't religious before?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say completely Christian as it is, but I've had learned of it at the moment. So I've just started from the Old Testament at the moment, just slowly get from there. So it's not here or there at the moment, it's just literally just learning. So
Sure. What's your name?
that's Lenny.
Lenny.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Saboor. His name is Hassan. So, with the Old Testament,
When you're going to be like, so I'm literally like, just at extra, so I'm literally starting from scratch.
no worries. So I can give you a few pointers because I've read parts of the Bible. Now, Muslims, we respect the Bible. We don't see it as alien to us because the Quran mentions Jesus and Moses and Abraham and all these prophets. The Quran mentions them, and we have a lot of respect for them. We believe that Jesus is not the Son of God. That's where we're different. But when it comes to prophets, when it comes to morals, when it comes to family values, when it comes to the Day of Judgment, when it comes to justice on earth, there's a lot of similarity between Islam and Christianity. There's a lot.
At the start I said I've taken both sides.
Yeah. And one of the things the Quran teaches is that Muslims and Christians should come to a common denominator, a common ground, right? And the common ground is that we should only worship God. Because in society today, in the past they used to worship pagans, idols and these types of things. Today's society, we worship our own desires. We worship celebrities. There's a level of corruption in society where people care more about money than they care about their own family, right? So Islam teaches and Christianity teaches ultimately your love, your hope, your trust should be in God.
So that's on a religious basis is I prefer these that as a ground level. And I hear it's material stuff and the lack of family is what drove me to a religious basis. So that's where I'm sort of learned from. So it's not really
And do you know much about what Muslims believe about Jesus?
I've heard snippets, but yeah, it's
I'll give you something very interesting. Jesus is mentioned more in the Quran than the Prophet Muhammad. Peace be upon him. Yeah. So Jesus, for us, is a mighty messenger of God. He is somebody who we have a lot of respect for. As a Christian, do you believe that he's going to come back?
So you say as a Christian, no bias, it's literally just learning.
Okay,
So
fine.
I'm at the bottom level.
Sure. So do you believe Jesus is coming back? Okay, you're learning.
To learn the text.
Okay, sure.
To the New Testament.
We as Muslims believe he's coming back. We believe he's going to start